최근 루나와 테라 폭락 사태로 블록체인과 암호화폐 시장에 대한 신뢰가 추락하고 있습니다. 여러 가지 미래 가능성도 있지만 리스크도 있는 만큼 투자자분들은 앞으로의 전망에 대해서도 궁금하실 텐데요. 그래서 저희는 블록체인 및 암호화폐 개발 투자사인 애니모카브랜즈의 야시우 회장을 직접 만나서 암호화폐와 블록체인에 관한 그의 생각을 들어봤습니다. Hello, this is Gio Lee. Welcome back to Talk with the Global Group today. We are delighted to have Mr. Yassiu. He's co-founder and chairman of Animocabränz and one of the leading figures in Hong Kong's information technology industry. Mr. Yassiu, great to see you.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Let's start with the first question. Please introduce the Animocabränz you're working for to Korean investors.
So Animocabränz is a company that's focused on delivering what we call true digital property rights. So in other words, the ability to have actual ownership of our digital assets. We started off early with CryptoKitties back in 2017. So we were one of the earliest companies involved in NFTs, became investors in Terra Labs as a result, and then started to not only build our own sort of games and sort of blockchain games and NFT sort of environments, but we also invested in companies because we needed their help to grow the ecosystem. Because if you remember back in 2018, very few companies actually even knew what an NFT was. So we invested in companies like what became Axie Infinity, Sky Mavis, OpenSea, Wax, Decentraland. We also basically helped build and incubate really the Sandbox, which today has become probably one of the biggest open metaverse players. And today we have over 220 investments, but we also have many operating groups, including what we do with Rev Racing, Phantom Galaxies, Tower, for instance. And I guess most recently, we've also been quite public about our work that we're doing together with the Bored Apes, basically with the Bored Apes game that we're doing, and also involvement in the Metaverse project, such as the Other Deed. And of course, the launch, we're one of the launch contributors of ApeCoin, which is probably one of the biggest metaverse tokens in the world today. So many things that we've been working in the space and looking to continue grow the space to create a open and decentralized future.
You are actively investing in promising projects as well as directly developing blockchain-related services. On what basis are you investing?
So the main reason we invest in the space so heavily is, well, one way to think of it is that despite all the volatility, we think of the space very similar to the earliest days of the internet. So it's a little bit like, if you believe, as we do, that the metaverse, Web3, is the natural successor of where the internet is today, then billions of people will use it, right? If we're right. And so in that sense, it's a little bit like investing in technology companies in 1999 or 2000, right? If you could have an opportunity to invest in, Amazon or Alibaba or Tencent or Epic Games or any SoftBank, whatever, any of those companies today that obviously giants in the industry, even like Apple or Microsoft, but you had a chance to invest in them, but back in the earliest days. That's what we think. That's what we believe. So it makes sense for us to invest. And one of the things for us as well is we look for everything that will help add more network effects to non-fungible tokens. In other words, digital property, right? Because for us, NFTs represent the digital property, like virtual land, virtual cars, virtual assets. And so anything we invest in that can add to the network effect is worthy to invest, because they don't all have to succeed, but the ones that will succeed will be tremendously successful because we see exponential growth opportunity in the metaverse. I can give sort of an example here. Because the metaverse, Web3, is entirely open, which means that we believe that the most successful projects have to be the ones that embrace as much openness and interoperability as possible. But the problem is that in a traditional Web2 style of investing, how do you benefit from the network effect that is no longer just yours? Now, this is a problem because as an investor, you want to know which product can I invest in that has the most sort of, a benefit and in traditional zero-sum thinking. But then take a look at open source. it's very hard to invest in open source because open source doesn't have like an equity or component structure. But we know that open source has changed the world. We know that because of open source, you can have, basically Google, you can have Android, you can have blockchain technology. It's all because of open source. Open source was probably the technological sort of social sort of innovation that completely changed the world of technology and opportunity. But who were the ones who were able to benefit financially from this? Actually, it was the investors in the companies that used open source, right? Because you can't invest in open source itself. So in the same sense, in Web3, how do you benefit? Well, we can help grow the ecosystem, but we have to also participate in the ownership of everything that is built on top of Web3, right? Meaning you can't just invest in the equity. You have to invest in the tokens, or you have to invest in the NFTs as well, right? And so this comes down to our strategy and our thought as well. In order to continue to participate in this growth, we can build, but we must also invest, which I think is the future for, really, I think, all companies in the world.
Recently, you are working with Cube Entertainment to promote the metaverse music business centered on K-pop. In Korea, Musica, which is a copyright trading service, has already been launched, but it is experiencing difficulties such as recording laws as it is embroiled in controversy of violating the Capital Market Act. I wonder what kind of difference in competitiveness there is compared to the musical model.
So one of the biggest challenges for any token structure is around the question of when is it a security, right? And the point being is, what is the reason that you are investing or buying it, right? So if you are doing something, for instance, that has a royalty share or a revenue share, because you own this token, then it probably is a security, which means it would be a violation of various capital acts, not just in Korea, but probably all over the world, right? And that to us really is, not thinking about sort of what it is that you're selling and how you're selling it, right? It also means that probably, and again, I don't know the Musical people, but maybe they didn't understand what they were doing, right? Maybe they had a good idea, but they didn't understand the rules. They maybe didn't have lawyers involved and so on, right? Like we have a lot of lawyers that help us out because we are dealing with items of value. So what we're doing with Cube and what we're generally doing is, we're selling culture, right? And if you think about it, by selling culture, like a painting, maybe it's valuable, but there is a utility in the fact that it's beautiful and that you can look at it, or it's maybe a social sort of signal. And if you think about the ownership of physical property, much of what we purchase is mostly for social signaling or for social identity. Like for instance, when you buy a car or when you buy a watch, right? Like a rare watch, or even if you buy a Birkin bag or you buy expensive clothes and shoes, I like diamonds as an example. Nobody thinks of buying diamonds necessarily as an investment, but everyone who buys a diamond says it's an investment, right? But we all know that probably it's not a great investment. But then the diamond is more than just, for money. Actually, you buy a diamond because it's beautiful, because it's a symbol of love, or these things, right? And so our partnership with Cube is similar that way, in the sense that we're selling NFTs, which are basically cultural valuable identities, things that we associate with because we love the characters in question, or because we want to be involved with it somehow, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to come with a sort of expectation of financial return. But there's also other ways to look at the model. Take a look at, for instance, Bored Apes, right? When you buy a Bored Ape, you own, for each of the individual Bored Apes, you actually own the copyright and the commercial rights of that Bored Ape. And because you own it, you can choose to do whatever you want with it, but it is your asset to do with as you please. That is not a security, because you're doing the work to make it valuable if you want to, right? And the fact that the Bored Ape could be valuable more or less is, a part of the effort that you provided to it. And so you could still have value from this, but it is not a security because it's not passive income and because it's not sort of a dividend generating item in and of itself, right? It's like, when you buy a house, that's not a security either, right? If you buy a house, you have to work it, you have to maintain it, you have to do work to create value, right? And that's the main differential here. So with our partnership with Cube is more looking towards the direction of sort of culture and sort of social value.
As the corona pandemic ends, there is a forecast that the metaverse market will shrink, with the number of Roblox and Axie Infinity users decreasing. I wonder if these services will be able to maintain competitiveness even in the endemic era.
It's interesting because definitely the business space, COVID, and actually video gaming and everything accelerated and increased dramatically because of COVID. Because people were at home, like the people in the Philippines, they didn't have a choice and they couldn't find other kinds of work. So they have to go and find metaverse work, and they found Axie Infinity and so forth and so on. So that's obviously the acceleration point. But mid to long term, our view is that the space will continue to grow. And it's different from Roblox versus Axie Infinity or versus any kind of metaverse game, for instance, because Roblox is already at a point, is addressing a market that, they have hundreds of millions of users. They're already addressing a market that is currently about 3.2 billion people in the world, which is most of the people online today, right? I think we have 4.6, 4.7 billion people in the world. The open metaverse, like Sandbox or, Rev Racing, Phantom Galaxies, Axie Infinity, right? These products, the audience is less than 20 million in the world, worldwide. So if you believe that blockchain gaming is going to take over traditional gaming, then we have a long way to go from 20 million users to 3 billion users, right? Of course, if we're wrong, then it doesn't matter, right? But if we're right about this, even if we only go to 1 billion users, that's still a long way to go for growth, right? So macro-wise, we're not concerned. And what we're seeing from the metrics and the numbers, we're continuing to see growth in terms of usage. Now, there may be a distinction. People might look at, but the market cap of the token is low, or the value isn't as high anymore. That's possibly true. Nobody's saying that the value of these projects before were maybe necessarily the right value at that time, because before it was a lot of scarcity. Now we have a lot of more GameFi and blockchain gaming projects out there, so you have more choices. But as an industry, I think this space will continue to grow exponentially. And so being able to participate in that sort of activity, I think is going to be beneficial, in particular for the players and for the game studios involved. As a gamer, especially understanding it, of course, but as a gamer, I can think of very few reasons why you wouldn't want to own your assets in the game, why you wouldn't want to have a say in the future of the game, and why you wouldn't at least have the choice, if you wanted to potentially earn an income from the game, right? Nobody said you have to, but the fact that you have that opportunity gives you much more optionality, and furthers the space, right? And that to me is such a better outcome that I think every gamer in the world will ultimately prefer to play a game in which they can own something than play a similar game in which they own nothing. So again, maybe in 5 or 10 years, we will hit saturation point like today, where the gaming industry is already almost at a maturity point. But the blockchain gaming point is not at the maturity point at all.
As P2E games, the game to earn money, became popular last year, many Korean game companies are also jumping into P2E market. However, as the coin price falling, it is experiencing difficulties. Are P2E games still a promising business?
First of all, I love Korean game companies because they're always really sort of looking towards the future. If you think about the earliest forms of item trading, companies like Item Bay and so on. I mean, many of them originated from Korea, right? So the idea of virtual item trading and having value in virtual goods is almost as old as the Korean video game industry, right? So Korean gamers always had an interest in this. The other thing I would say is that I think compared to many other nations, I think Korea has one of the strongest understanding of cultural soft power. So, it's people sometimes forget that it was only 40 years ago that Korea was a very poor nation, right? And today, Korea is, amongst the richest countries in the world, like number 12 or whatever, like it's huge, right? But Korea doesn't have oil, right? Doesn't have natural resources. It has people. It has culture. So the power of Korea came from its culture and its ability to propose and push culture like K-pop and K-drama and all that stuff to the world. And today, right? I was maybe a month and a half ago, because of my daughter, I attended a BTS concert in Las Vegas. Yeah, and it was amazing. Because it was amazing to see how this kind of culture can come to America and completely sort of, have screaming fans and all that stuff. 20 years ago, completely unimaginable that an Asian pop band would basically be a premier experience, in a big hall in Las Vegas. So it's quite amazing. So it's all about cultural soft power. So in that sense, gaming industry is like that too. Some of the biggest gaming companies in the world are all Korean. Some of the biggest games in the world come from Korea. So they understand this very well. So I think that, play to earn or play and earn, as people like to put it today, is going to continue to grow, particularly in Korea. There's a legal issue, of course, in Korea particularly, but Koreans themselves have, I think, an affinity towards the ability to own something and to have the right to make money from it if they want to. Many people, if you look at esports, like Korea was one of the first countries in the world to really, really dig into esports, with StarCraft, right? It's such an old title, but it all started then as well. So I think that's what many of the Korean game studios see, and they see the same trends in terms of opportunity, and so I think they won't give up, right? Even as the government says, we're not sure about play to earn, we're not sure about blockchain. I don't think any of the companies in Korea are going to stop necessarily. And I think the players themselves will want that because it's going to be such an important economic opportunity for Korea as a whole. Now, talk about the token prices. Because it's play and earn, the token prices can be temporary because the value can go up and down. But if you play a game which you enjoy and you have the option to make money, then the value of the token isn't that important. It is important, but it is not the most important. What value does is it introduces new players into the game that aren't active, that aren't skill-based or as active-based, because they can become almost investors in the game. So one of the challenges about game inclusivity is how do you make it easy for someone who doesn't have the skill to play the game? Mobile gaming became big, not because we all had a mobile phone. Nintendo actually had a mobile device much earlier than before. It's because playing a game on mobile was easy. I can just use a finger and I can play a game and be like an expert. And so that's how we went from hundreds of millions of gamers to billions of gamers, because it was easier to incorporate. Today, we have a new barrier in gaming, and the barrier is inclusivity for people who don't have time and who don't have the same skill. So for instance, I cannot play a game against my children anymore because they're much better than me, right? And I will regularly get killed by some 15-year-old kid or maybe 12-year-old kid because they have better hand-eye coordination, they're more skilled, right? It's a little bit like in order for you to enjoy basketball, you have to play at the NBA level, which of course only some people can do, but most people cannot. With blockchain gaming, you can now passively participate by maybe buying assets, by investing, and by enjoying it in a different way, which means I'm still emotionally connected to the game, but I don't have to play. I can give it to my son to play, for instance, right? So it might be my asset, but I give it to my children to play. I'm still related to the game. I'm still involved in the game, but it's more passive. It's how I can engage. So I think gaming will introduce a new set of users, which is what's happening with blockchain gaming, into the world of games that are joining the world of gaming, but not for skill-based, but for basically passive engagement. So I think that's the other paradigm that will change. So I think play and earn is really just the first, is like a sort of an incentive system to introduce new gamers, new type of gamers into the gaming ecosystem.
What is your opinion on the Terra and Luna incidents in which 60 trillion won became a piece of tissue in an instant?
So, I mean, I feel very sorry for everyone who was exposed to Luna and UST. We as a company had no exposure to it, so it's not, it's, I think in particular in Korea, it has been difficult. So I would go down to the thinking of, many people, especially new people in blockchain, were confused because they thought UST was a stable coin, right? They were like, what's a stable coin? What happened here? We don't understand. But of course, it's not a stable coin like Circle or even Tether, right? It is not backed against an actual reserve, right? And one of the challenges you have with any kind of economic infrastructure, which is true in tokens as it is in the real world, it's based on a foundation of trust, right? So similarly, if every person in Korea was going to withdraw the Korean won, it'd probably be very difficult for the government and the banking system in Korea to support it. But there is broad trust in the ecosystem and there is support for it, and therefore, it's okay. And what happened, obviously, with Terra is that trust was completely broken, and as a result, the whole ecosystem collapsed. And there's a lot of material that discusses how it happened. I think the thing that what this will introduce, and I think it's necessary, is obviously some form of regulation, right? If Terra went out and created a token ecosystem but never said it was a stablecoin, then maybe it would be looked at differently. If it wasn't pegged to the assumption that it must be equal to $1, right? Because it's almost like people feel a safety through the assumption that $1 is backed by some value, when in fact it isn't, right? So I think this is where regulation comes in, that if you say that you're a stable coin, then you have to prove you're a stable coin in the traditional sense. I think that's important for the health of the ecosystem. I don't believe people set out to do something bad, but because the value became so big, it started to get exposed, right? And people trusted it without understanding the fundamentals. So the other thing is research, right? People will become more, I think, more wary and more careful about what they invest in. But like with every system, it's going through a growth and maturity stage.
NFTs, which have been attracting attention as new investment destination along with the cryptocurrencies, are also plunging along with the bubble theory. How do you see?
So actually, I would not really completely agree with this idea that NFTs are plunging in the same way. So if you look at the ETH value of the NFTs, they're actually similar from 3 to 6 months ago. What's actually different, particularly for blue chips like Sandbox Land or Bored Apes or that kind of stuff, that has maintained. A Bored Ape is probably 90 to 100 ETH still right now. But of course, because ETH has dropped, right, relative to, say, 3 months ago, it appears that the value has dropped. And I think we also need to look at perspectives of time. If you compare the value of a Bored Ape 1 year ago or even 9 months ago, actually the value is very high. If you entered the crypto space only 4 months ago, it might feel like, oh my goodness, right, this has dropped. But time doesn't work, like development doesn't happen in 24 hours as much as we like it to be. Like, I know people are impatient, but this stuff takes years to develop. So when you look at the macro over the last sort of 9 to 12 months, and you just take a look, well, what was the price of the NFT then? What is it today over the time? And yeah, it's like this, but broadly it is up. Not by a little, but by a lot. And then that would be true for many NFT projects, right? If you compare mint price to where it is today. So I think NFTs have a different quality to fungible tokens. I think fungible tokens are much more volatile. The reason they're much more volatile is because there is no human association with the NFT, which means there is no value that is really locked in a cultural context. So we describe NFTs as a store of culture. Right? Because when you own an NFT, it's like owning any asset in the world. We provide our own sentimentality, our own attachments to it. Like a wedding ring is a very sentimental attachment. The material of the wedding ring is not valuable at all, but what is contained in the memory and the history of that ring in the generations that passes on is really precious. So when I buy a painting, for instance, I look at a painting and I don't buy the painting because I want to sell it tomorrow, but I do buy the painting because I like it. And maybe I want to sell it, or maybe I never want to sell it because I think it's beautiful, it looks great, or it's maybe a social status to me, or whatever it is. These become things that you can no longer sell because they're just too attached to who you are. In our own life, for physical items, we have probably hundreds of objects like this, right, that we will never sell because they're so precious to us, right? That is essentially a kind of locked value, a locked cultural value, right? And NFTs represent this. So that's why I think NFTs, don't have the same volatility relative to fungible tokens, because it's like a dollar bill. If I have $100, it's, I can trade it for another $100. It's not, doesn't mean anything to me, right? But maybe if I have, like game items or paintings or whichever, they may mean something to me that's more special. And that's why sort of it has more value there. So I don't think it's quite the same, right? And one example we can look at is, for instance, the world of real estate. The economy might collapse and there'll be an adjustment in physical real estate prices. But typically the high-end real estate in the best districts normally stay in value, right? Because the people who own it don't need to sell, right? And while there's a little bit of volatility, it actually stays largely the same, right? Because of its locked cultural value. And that's the same that we see in physical land. Like the most expensive property in Sandbox is not dropping in value at all, right? And the most expensive Bored Ape is still worth millions of dollars today, right? With NFT sales, for instance, with Other Deed and Codas and everything, I think close to $1 billion, if not more, has been generated within the first week of that sale, both in primary and secondary. And this was in May. This is not that long ago, right?
I know you made intensive investment in 2018 when the coin market froze, but now global interest rates are on the rise, so it's different from back then in every way. How do you expect the coin market to develop?
So just to be clear, Animocabränz is not really a coin/token investor. I mean, we do invest in tokens for the projects. We are an NFT investor in the sense that we invest in projects that support NFTs, and some of them come with tokens, right? So that's the main thesis point. So we believe very strongly that NFTs are going to be the backbone, the economic backbone, as physical property is to the physical world of essentially the digital economy. So that's very, very important to us. So right now we're going through, just like 2018 and 2019, there's a builder phase. The people who are here only to make money, maybe they've gone away, right? Because they're like, okay, I don't know how I can manage in this market. It's too volatile or something. But actually the people who believe in it and are building, to me, this is the best time because a little bit quieter, people can concentrate on the work, right? And frankly, those companies that are not very strong, maybe many of them don't deserve to get funded. Maybe many of them, as you go through a shakeout, it's like, the dot-com boom, for instance, right? When the dot-com bubble burst, that didn't mean the internet was dead, actually. It just meant that the companies that maybe didn't deserve to be there ended up basically, obviously, disappearing. But the companies that remained, who had the financial strength, who had the ability, and who had the vision, they ended up becoming much bigger companies as a result of that, right? Because you could also argue that in a down market, there is also less competition, right? That's definitely true as well. And especially if the macro is that the space is growing. So that means that, from our perspective, anyone who's in this industry, we think that this is a good buying opportunity for the blue chips, right? If you can get investments in the big projects that have long-term viability because they're financially strong, they have good vision, they have good product. Our position is that we think this is the right time it's a good entry time, we think.
There are many celebrities around the world who warn that 95% of cryptocurrencies will go bankrupt. Which blockchain companies do you think will survive to the end?
Well, I mean, it's similar to my first answer, which is that you have to look at the blue chips, you have to look at the big companies, right? But one big difference between when people talk about the supposed bankruptcy, right, is that unlike things that are not on chain, is that when a business is bankrupt, then you lose everything because nobody is there to maintain it, and the ownership is sort of, gone, right? Well, because it's in shares and equity. But in blockchain, even if the project is abandoned, the assets themselves, whether it's the coin or the NFT, they continue, right? They don't disappear just because the company is bankrupt. So take an example right now, like right now with Terra, right? So everyone received the new Luna, and there's some value, through the fork, and who knows what the value of this token is. But everyone else still got to keep their original UST or their old Luna, which is basically now called, UST Classic. And, that may not be worth a lot, but it still has value. People are still trading it. People are still doing stuff with it. Maybe someone will build a separate community. You don't know. But the point is, it's not gone forever. It's still there, right? And so there's an interesting concept around this ownership where you can still build on something from, because there's a community that owns it. Maybe it's not a good community, you don't want to be involved. But let's say if you have a good community, you can still find ways in which you can participate and benefit in different ways, right? So it's fascinating, I think, because the concept of the traditional sort of bankruptcy no longer functions on chain because the assets exist forever.
There seems to be a trend in the blockchain industry and the coin market as well. For example, metaverse, Web3, and NFT receive the most attention. What do you think will be the next trend that will lead the market?
First of all, I think gaming and metaverse will continue to be big, only because one, it's still a small number of people that are in the open metaverse. We still need more people to enter. And the second one, I think the metaverse, because of things like Ready Player One and because of our imagination and science fiction, is sort of, for most people, the easiest thing to understand about the value of the virtual world. Like everyone who plays games understands conceptually what the metaverse could be or why it's important, right? It's easier to understand. Our direction, the way that we think of Animoca brands, like when we entered into the gaming world, we were thinking more in terms of impact. So it was less important for us to think where the industry is going. I mean, that's obviously important. We broadly think digital property rights is important, but rather we were focused on which industries need it the most, right? That have the most impact. So when we started with gaming 4 years ago, we believed very strongly that gamers needed it because one, they didn't own any of their assets in the video games, but they really wanted it. And that actually it was a good way in which players who spend time playing these games could offer value. Because after all, if the free players stop playing games, then the game itself has less value, which means the people who pay for the games will pay less money, right? So play to earn and play and earn makes sense because you're rewarding the participants to spend time in the game. So that is one industry because gamer time is worth 0 today, and actually you can reward it. And there's billions of people playing games. So that's impact. So that's why we entered the space. And also we have a gaming background. So the other area that we think will make a big impact, which we talked about maybe a month or two ago in an article, is education. Now we don't. So just to be clear, do we think that the blockchain industry is looking at education? No, right? Very few people I know in DeFi are thinking about education, right? Because it's not your traditional space to make money. But we think it's important because teachers, for instance, are probably one of the most important members in society because they deliver very important service for our children and for the next generation. And if you think about it, for a nation's culture, it starts with schools, right? But relative to the value they receive very little for the importance that they do for their country. So for us, it's not so much where's the trend going, but rather for us is which industry needs tokenizing, which industry needs property rights more. So we think teachers and education need it more. So we're focusing on that now. And if we are successful, like we did with gaming, then maybe it can become a big industry. We don't think of it in terms of where it will go. Rather we want to try to help lead the industry into a direction that we think is important. We don't know if this will work, but we are certainly going to try.
According to a survey result, 62% of cryptocurrency investors in Korea are young MZ generation in their 20s and 30s. As a successful cryptocurrency entrepreneur and investor, what advice would you give to them?
The fact that it's a lot of young people is not really a surprise to me. There's a macro, and I think the macro has to do with, a few things. One of them is, I think the younger generation is digitally much more fluid, of course, right? They grew up in this digital age, they play video games, they're online all the time. So they understand that much more. Like even things like NFTs is easier to understand for the younger generation because most of their time is digital, their attention is digital. So the value, the social identity, being of digital importance is greater than maybe even physical importance. Whereas my parents would really struggle with this because they're like, why do you need this? I don't understand. Isn't it better to, buy a nice car, right? For the same effect. That's because, many people today don't care about your nice car, but they care about your Bored Ape, right? So that's kind of the parallel difference there. So the younger generation just understands this better. But also because they're digitally fluent, they can navigate the space better than other people. Like if you're older and you don't, I look at the world of blockchain a little bit like, and the metaverse, a little bit like, doing business in China 20 or 30 years ago, right? Meaning that China was obviously growing fast and it was a bit volatile, but you can only succeed in China if you move to China. And if you're working in China, because you have to understand the culture, you have to understand the people, you have to understand how it works. And then you had a lot of investors outside of China who were like investing in China because they were excited about the growth, but actually they didn't do so well, some of them, because they didn't understand the culture, because they didn't live in China. They weren't doing anything there. It's really hard, right? I think the same is true for Korea. When Korea was growing, a lot of outside investors was like, we want to invest in Korea. But until you actually live in Korea, until you open an office, until you actually do business in Korea, it's very hard, right? And it's the same for the metaverse. You can't just invest in the metaverse. You have to live in the metaverse, right? You have to do stuff. You have to buy NFTs. You have to maybe trade tokens. You have to be in DeFi. And when you understand that, then you've learned it and, you'll be better at it. I think the paradigms are such that, our parents' generation, for instance, they used to be able to put money in a term deposit in a bank and they can make 10% interest. That was maybe 30 years ago or maybe not that long ago, right? Today, if I take money and put in as a term deposit, I'm lucky if I make 0.1%, right? And it's constantly inflating, right? So the financial system that worked for my parents and your parents is very different than for this generation. They have to find their own system. They have to find what works for them. Because one thing is certain, the existing system does not work for them, right? They don't have the same benefit. Like one of the reasons why we have so much inequity in the world and why many young people are so frustrated is they look at the job, they come out of university, and then they say, I can never own my house because the job will never pay me enough because of inflation and because I can't save. Whatever I save is worth less next year, right? This did not exist before, right? In our parents' generation, but it exists in this world. So they need the new paradigms. And the metaverse is natural to the young generation, right? They get it. It's their world. So they should take advantage of it.
I think we cover a lot. Thanks once again for sharing your insight.
My pleasure.
웹 3.0 인터넷 발전은 이커머스에서부터 미디어, 엔터테인먼트, 부동산에 이르기까지 모든 분야에서 혁신을 주도하기 시작한 만큼 새로운 투자 기회가 되어줄 것으로 보입니다. 지금까지 야시우 애니모카 회장과 이야기 나눠봤습니다. 시청해주신 여러분 고맙습니다.